Welcome to You're Not Broken, Just Rewiring, a free audiobook podcast by me, Glenn Ostlund. Chapter 14, Lemuria and the Cell That Stayed. Is it just me, or does your body remember something your mind forgot? Not a memory you can name, but a rhythm, a resonance, something soft and ancient humming just beneath the thoughts, like homeostasis, like harmony, like the quiet conversation inside your body, between liver and lung, skin and stomach, without a single word spoken. Maybe that's Lemuria, not a place on a map, but a pattern your cells still follow, a myth shaped like a mirror, showing you a version of yourself that knows how to stay in tune. Before neurons, before stories, before the ego learned to name itself, there was rhythm. There was resonance. There was a kind of listening beneath language, a coherence that lived in the quiet communion between cells. In this chapter, we explore the myth of Lemuria not as a lost civilization in the sea, but as a symbolic memory embedded in your fascia, your breath, your nervous system. We'll begin by tracing the esoteric accounts of Lemuria through the voices of Helena Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, James Churchward, the Mount Shasta channelers, and the raw material. Then we'll map those symbolic templates onto the scientific story of life before the neuron, focusing on the emergence of the cell membrane, mitochondrial symbiosis, and the first cooperative multicellular communities. Finally, we'll return to the body, not as a finished product, but as a living Lemuria, a relational intelligence still active beneath thought. A song your system has never stopped singing. Lemuria, in this sense, isn't a place you lost. It's a coherence you remember. And remembering it may be the first step in learning how to stay. This chapter is an attempt to remember, not through archaeology or doctrine, but through function, through the felt sense that something inside you still knows how to listen, how to respond, how to live in a state of coherence with everything else that lives. You won't find coordinates or fossils here. You'll find metaphors, mirrors, archetypes encoded in the breath. Because long before the nervous system developed the speed to think, it developed the capacity to feel, and long before it could feel shame, it felt resonance. Act 1. Lemuria as the echo of coherence. Lemuria, for the uninitiated, is the Atlantis you've never heard of. The name was coined in the 19th century, not by mystics, but by zoologists. Scientists puzzled by the appearance of lemur fossils in both Madagascar and India, but not Africa, proposed a lost landmass, bridging the Indian Ocean. They called it Lemuria. Geologists, with their understanding of plate tectonics, later rolled their eyes and moved on. But the esoteric world took the baton and ran. Lemuria became a mythical continent, a spiritual Eden said to predate Atlantis, a land of radiant beings, pure-hearted and telepathic, more feminine than Atlantis, more attuned to nature, less about technology, more about resonance. It's said that Lemurians didn't speak with words. They felt each other. They communed in song and light and frequency. They lived in harmony with Earth, in multi-dimensional awareness, in coherence before conflict. The idea of Lemuria took on esoteric life through the work of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a Russian mystic and co-founder of the Theosophical Society in 1875. Writing in The Secret Doctrine, 1888, Blavatsky outlined a sweeping cosmology of human evolution divided into 7 root races. Lemuria, she said, was the home of the 3rd root race, an early phase of humanity that preceded Atlantis, the 4th, and modern humans, the 5th. Drawing from what she claimed were ancient Eastern teachings preserved in secret brotherhoods, Blavatsky described Lemurians as gigantic, long-lived, and not yet fully physical. They were psychic and instinctual, dreamlike in their perception, and guided by spiritual beings known as the Lords of the Flame. These beings didn't teach with words. They imprinted truths directly into the astral bodies of early humanity. Blavatsky's Lemuria was not idyllic in the modern utopian sense. It was elemental, raw, still in flux. Her vision was shaped by the 19th century fascination with evolution, but also with occult hierarchy. The Lemurians, she claimed, reproduced through budding and egg-laying until the sexes divided and sexuality emerged, an evolutionary event that triggered a descent into denser form and eventually into karmic struggle. As thought, will, and individuality arose, the group mind of Lemuria fractured, and so began the slow drift toward Atlantis, where mind eclipsed instinct and the battle for polarity began. Decades later, Rudolf Steiner, an Austrian philosopher and spiritual teacher who broke from theosophy to found anthroposophy, expanded on these themes. In lectures given between 1904 and 1924, Steiner described Lemuria as an epoch where humanity existed in a state of pre-personal will. Lemurians, in Steiner's view, didn't act out of self-interest or thought. They were moved by impressions, instinctual gestures shaped by the spiritual beings around them. They lived in a kind of psychic dream time, responding to their environment with fluid sensitivity. There were no I, me, minds yet, only movement of life, passing through a not yet solidified human form. Steiner taught that Lemurians had access to clairvoyant perception, and that their downfall came not from external destruction, but from the internal spark of will, the beginning of separation from the spiritual world. The discovery of fire was both literal and symbolic, an eruption of autonomy that marked the end of innocence. Then came James Churchward, a British occultist, inventor, and former soldier who claimed in the 1920s to have discovered ancient tablets in India describing the lost continent of Mu, his term for Lemuria. In books like The Lost Continent of Mu, 1926, Churchward presented Mu as the mother civilization of all world's cultures. He claimed Mu once spanned the Pacific Ocean and was home to over 60 million people who lived in peace, spiritual alignment, and scientific advancement. The Knuckles, as he called them, were supposedly the original priests and scientists of Earth, spreading knowledge to Egypt, India, Central America, and beyond. Though dismissed by scholars as pseudo-archaeology, Churchward's work influenced decades of speculative thought and seeded New Age mythology. His Lemurians were less dreamlike and more human, still exalted, but technological, organized, powerful. In a sense, Churchward's Mu bridged Blavatsky's ethereal Lemuria and the coming myth of Atlantis. In North America, the myth continued to evolve. This time through Frederick Spencer Oliver, who published A Dweller on Two Planets in 1905. The book, claimed to be dictated by a disincarnate being named Philos the Thebetan, blended esoteric teachings with speculative sci-fi and described both Atlantis and Lemuria in spiritual terms. Oliver located Lemurian survivors at Mount Shasta, a majestic volcano in Northern California. From there, new mythologies sprang, stories of an underground city called Telos, crystalline temples, and radiant beings who lived in a fifth-dimensional state of harmony. Throughout the 20th century, these stories were expanded by Guy Ballard, the I Am Movement, Diane Robbins, and others. Telos became a symbol for spiritual sanctuary, higher vibration, and eternal inner guidance. Lemuria was no longer just a lost civilization. It was a vibration that could be felt, channeled, even remembered. And then there's Ra, the sixth density social memory complex channeled in the Law of One material during the early 1980s by Don Elkins, Carla Ruckert, and Jim McCarty. Ra spoke of Mu as an Earth civilization existing around 53,000 years ago. It was not technologically advanced, but it was spiritually attuned. According to Ra, Mu was destroyed by tectonic activity, and its people, gentle and peaceful, migrated to what is now South America, eventually contributing to early social memory complexes there. Ra doesn't describe Mu in elaborate detail. Instead, they position it as one node in a broader planetary curriculum, a lesson in harmony before polarity. A civilization that, while in simple form, lived close to the Law of One. So we are left with a chorus of voices: Helena Blavatsky's Third Root Race, Rudolf Steiner's Dreamlike Will, James Churchward's Techno-Spiritual Empire, Frederick Oliver's Subterranean Sanctuary, Ra's Social Coherence. Each form tells a different story. Each paints a different face on the same functional memory. And the deeper patterns converge. Life before fragmentation, consciousness before cognition, relationship before identity, coherence before conflict. Viewing it from this fundamental perspective, perhaps Lemuria isn't just a forgotten chapter of planetary history. Perhaps it's a metaphor for something still living inside you, a way of being that isn't about retreating from life, but relating to it differently, softly, responsively, without the need to dominate, name, or explain. Maybe that's why the myth endures, not because it tells us where we came from, but because it reminds us what we still are. And maybe you felt it, in the breath between words, in the moment before reaction, in the whisper that says, stay. Let me tell you a story. Not a parable, not a peer-reviewed theory, just a whisper from the ancestral field. You can call it myth or memory. The cell that stayed and the spark that moved in. Once upon a billion years ago, in a warm little tide pool, lived a cell named Selly. Just for fun, let's call her a Lemurian, because that's kind of how things were back then. She wasn't flashy, but she was stable. She had boundaries. She could hold shape. She could sense the world around her. She knew how to say yes, how to say no. She had survived a lot. Her kind always had. She had a membrane, a soft, sentient threshold. Not a wall, but a filter, a way of discerning what belonged, what nourished, what threatened, What could be transformed? She didn't have a brain. She didn't need one. She was an orchestra in a bubble, full of molecules dancing to ancient rhythms, lipids folding, proteins unfurling, chemical signals pulsing in and out like breath. Life was happening inside her, not because she thought it into being, but because she knew how to stay, even though she didn't know that she knew what she knew. It was more like just being than knowing back then. And then came Mitch, another Lemurian, but of a very different kind. Mitch wasn't a cell like Selly. He was a bacterium. Molecular relationships formed in different ways to survive. He was smaller, hungrier, faster. He didn't just live, he burned. He metabolized oxygen in a way that turned danger into fuel. He was intense, chaotic, a spark on legs. He had evolved to survive the Great Oxygenation Event, a planetary shift that had made the environment toxic for many early cells like Selly. Oxygen, which we now see as life-giving, was once a poison to the early Earth. Mitch had figured out how to harness it, to turn fire into power. But that power came at a cost. Mitch was unstable on his own. He burned too hot. He had no shelter from the storm. Selly hadn't evolved to metabolize oxygen. It choked her. Mitch hadn't evolved for the increasing heat. It dissolved him. Mitch was either going to find a new home or burn out trying. Their kinds rarely got along. Some cells tried to devour the bacteria like Mitch's. Some Mitches hijacked cells and replicated until the host burst. Most pairings ended in collapse. But one Selly and one Mitch didn't compete. They related. Instead of fighting, they merged. Not in domination, but in discernment. Selly made space. Her membrane folded inward, not to digest, but to invite. Mitch entered, not as a parasite, not as a prisoner, but as a partner. She offered structure. He offered fire. She gave continuity. He gave transformation. And somehow, in that moment of unlikely agreement, they became something new. That was the birth of mitochondria, a necessary merging before multicellular communities could form. Mitch, the aerobic bacterium, once wild and solitary, found shelter inside Selly's membrane, and together they became the first eukaryotic cell, the ancestor of every animal, every plant, every nervous system that would one day sense and seek and suffer and sing. Your breath, your heartbeat, your thoughts, they're all powered by that ancient yes, that ancestral agreement. You are the descendant of a successful relationship. Most pairings didn't work. Millions failed. But the ones that did work, they evolved. They survived. And now they live in every cell of your body. This is more than biology. It's a blueprint. It's a prophecy. It's relational intelligence written into the fabric of life. Your body knows how to partner, to metabolize danger into fuel, to stay open without being overrun, to hold a boundary while letting something new in. This isn't something to learn. It's something to remember. Sometimes your mind forgets. It overrides. It builds walls where filters would do. It forces harmony where discernment is needed. It floods the system with stories, commands, scripts. But the wisdom of Selly and Mitch is still alive in you, in your mitochondria, in your membranes, in your nervous system, in your relational instincts. Every crisis becomes a lab for remembering. Not everything belongs, but some things do. And the real work is learning how to tell the difference. Because the cell that stayed, she wasn't weak, she was wise. Act 2. The Science of Coherence, before the nervous system. Long before your brain could think, your cells could feel. Before your body evolved neurons, it evolved membranes. Before communication traveled through electricity, it moved through chemistry. Slow, intentional, and relational. Life did not begin with cognition. It began with contact. The scientific story of your origin doesn't begin with humans or mammals or even multicellular life. It begins in the ocean. Nearly 4 billion years ago, the Earth was not a welcoming place by today's standards. Lightning struck, volcanoes roared, radiation surged, and somehow, within this chaos, came a whisper of order. Molecules bumped into one another until some began to cooperate. And somewhere, in a shallow tide pool, a membrane formed. A simple bubble, sealed off from its surroundings, yet open enough to exchange with the world. It was not conscious, but it was discerning. It let in what nourished. It kept out what harmed. And it became the first boundary that held a living self. That boundary was the beginning of interoception. Not awareness of the world, but awareness of the inside. Before anything could sense a predator, it had to sense a pH imbalance. Before anything could run, it had to notice it was overheating. Your earliest ancestors weren't thinkers or even movers. They were sensors. They responded to subtle gradients in salt, heat, acidity. They moved toward what sustained them. They shrank from what threatened their coherence. Then came the great transformation, the endosymbiotic event. As described in the work of microbiologist Lynn Margulis, one single-celled organism, our metaphorical cellie, engulfed another, Mitch, without digesting him. The engulfed cell brought with it a new trick, the ability to metabolize oxygen. This was the first energy partnership. The host gave shelter, the symbiont gave power, the two became one, and that one became the eukaryotic cell, the ancestor of all complex life. From that union came plants, fungi, and animals, but not overnight. For billions of years, life remained mostly unicellular. Each cell still self-contained, still communicating only by direct contact or through chemical diffusion. Then, slowly, cooperation expanded. Cells began to cluster. Some specialized. Some gave up their ability to reproduce in exchange for a shared function like digesting food, moving muscle, or transmitting information. And eventually, these communities became multicellular organisms. The first multicellular beings were simple: algae, filaments, colonies. They weren't centralized. They didn't have nervous systems. But they had something just as essential: communication. Chemical gradients, electrical charges, calcium waves that pulsed from cell to cell. This is the forgotten substrate of feeling, how life learned to stay together. Take sponges, for example. Among the simplest animals, they have no nerves, no brains, and yet they coordinate. Their cells beat in rhythm to move water through their porous bodies, filtering nutrients and oxygen. They know what to hold, what to let pass. They are the biological expression of selective permeability, a concept we'll revisit as a metaphor for boundaries. Even before the first neuron ever fired, cells were conducting intercellular symphonies. Cilia beat in synchrony. Gap junctions allowed ions to flow between neighbors. Receptors received molecular messages and adjusted accordingly. The body was already a community, long before it was a self. And then, somewhere around 600 million years ago, something extraordinary happened. A cell developed the ability to generate and transmit an electrical signal down its elongated body. This allowed for faster, longer distance coordination. No longer limited to chemical diffusion, it could now fire messages like lightning. That cell was the first neuron. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because here, right here before neurons and brains and minds, is Lemuria, the Lemuria of biology, a time when life coordinated not by controlling, but by resonating, when every signal was a response to the environment, not a command from above, when intelligence wasn't centralized but distributed, when cooperation wasn't engineered, it was instinctive. Your body remembers this, not as content, but as process. Your heart cells still pulse in rhythm with one another, even outside the body. Your gut still signals the brain before the brain interprets the signal. Your fascia still holds memory long after the conscious mind has forgotten. This isn't metaphor, it's cellular reality. You are not a top-down system with a brain in charge. You are a field of coherence that once existed without cognition and still does. The signals are ancient. The language is older than words. It lives in chemistry, in shape, in flow, in the way your breath changes when someone you love walks into the room, in the tightening of your chest before a thought arises, in the knowing that comes before knowing why. This is Lemuria, not as legend, but as function. Not a sunken continent, but a living memory, a state of relational intelligence that predates mind. And now that we've remembered it, we can begin to reintegrate it. Act 3. Lemuria as the nervous system remembering itself. So where does this all leave us? Not in the past, not in myth or microbiology alone, but right here, in the living field of your body, where memory isn't stored in words, but in rhythm, in the spaces between thoughts, in the tissue-deep intelligence that still listens before you speak. Lemuria, in this light, becomes less about what once was, and more about what still is. It becomes a way of being that has never entirely disappeared, just gone quiet beneath the noise of modern mind. Because the truth is, your body already knows how to Lemuria. It knows how to move toward coherence, how to listen across systems, how to discern without panic. The early cells weren't trying to build a nervous system. They were responding, adapting, communicating. They were in relationship. And when you respond with presence instead of reflex, when your breath slows and your gut softens, you return to that same logic, not dominance, but discernment. You return to that same ancient state of being. This is the essence of interoception, the body's ability to sense itself from the inside out. Before the neocortex rationalized and verbalized, the nervous system was already narrating through waves of sensation, through pulses of electrical charge, through chemical cascades and subtle shifts in tone. Every emotion you feel is a whisper from this internal landscape, a message encoded in breath, posture, pulse. As Dr. Stephen Porges has shown through polyvagal theory, your autonomic nervous system is constantly scanning for safety, not just out there in the world, but in here, between your organs, your cells, your relational field. And when it finds that safety, even fleetingly, it returns to the Lemurian rhythm, the ventral vagal state, the grounded hum of belonging. Not because danger has vanished, but because your system remembers how to respond without collapse. It remembers the cell that stayed, the one that partnered, the one that made space for something new. You don't have to become something else to find that rhythm again. You don't have to master stillness or silence every thought. You only have to notice what's already happening, how your shoulders drop when you feel seen, how your breath deepens when you let go, how your belly releases when your boundary is honored. These aren't self-help strategies. They're somatic truths, functional remnants of a coherence that predates your ego and will outlive your story. And perhaps that's what the myth of Lemuria really is, a metaphor for the body before the mind took over, a symbolic placeholder for the systems inside you that never stopped listening, never stopped adjusting, never stopped remembering how to stay in tune. You don't need to believe in ancient continents or subterranean crystal cities to feel the truth of this. You only need to feel your own body becoming more itself when you stop fighting it, when you stop fleeing from it, when you return to the rhythm that is always there. You are not a single self. You are a symphony of systems. You are not broken. You are adaptive. You are not lost. You are layered. And beneath those layers, the myth is still alive. Spiral reflection. So ask yourself, where have I confused collapse for calm? Where have I mistaken hypervigilance for intuition? Where have I learned to survive by shutting down when what I long for is to stay present? What if the part of me that pauses to feel, that sets a boundary of love instead of fear, that slow, steady part that listens before reacting, is the myth still alive? What if Lemuria isn't a lost civilization, but a living intelligence that never left? You're not broken. You're a sacred continent rising again from beneath the static, the radiant telepathic telos navigating the world within the Mount Shasta of your mind. Lemuria isn't gone. It's layered in your fascia, your breath, your belly, and the cell that stayed, still singing, still sensing, still you. You're not behind. You're not a mistake. You are the first cell whispering yes again, this time with awareness, this time with discernment, sensing, adjusting, rewiring, always. Postscript, a foreshadowing of Atlantis. In the myths, Lemuria didn't fall, it faded. It didn't crash, it quieted. Its legacy wasn't ruin, but resonance, a hum in the tissues, a way of being so soft it became invisible, but never stopped existing. But what happens when that coherence fractures? When the hum is drowned out by the roar of overthinking, overproving, overprotecting? When the mind, brilliant and eager, begins to mistrust the body? When the breath is overridden and the self gets split? That's where we go next. If Lemuria is the memory of harmony, Atlantis is the metaphor for disconnection. not evil, not failure, just brilliance ungrounded. A system trying to lead without listening. Where Lemuria communed in chorus, Atlantis performed a solo. It wasn't betrayal, it was evolution out of balance. Because brilliance without embodiment can tip into collapse. And when the signal gets scrambled, when wisdom turns to noise, the system forgets how to tune back in. The path forward, then, isn't more knowing. It's remembering how to feel. In the next chapter, we'll descend into the Atlantean metaphor, not as a warning, but as a map of what happens when thought outruns sensation, when boundaries harden into barricades, when connection becomes conditional. Until then, may your cells keep singing. May your nervous system remember the Lemurian rhythm it never lost, and may the myth inside you keep unfolding, layer by layer, signal by signal, breath by breath. Rewiring, not broken, always.